United Nations peacekeepers are an invaluable resource for regions of the world facing war and conflict. With more than 100,000 peacekeepers on 15 peacekeeping operations worldwide, the vast majority protect civilians on the front lines of those conflicts. But in many regions, especially Africa, peacekeepers bring with them challenges, including allegations of sexual abuse, spread of disease, and abuse of power. Zachariah Mampilly is the Director of African Studies at Vassar College. Welcome, Zachariah.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the challenges that peacekeeping operations are facing in Africa. There have been allegations that peacekeepers have illegally sold on weapons to rebel groups that were then used to attack civilians. There have been violent demonstrations against peacekeepers and their actions in other countries. There are allegations of sexual abuse across Africa on the part of peacekeepers. Why are these things coming to light?
Well, part of it, I think, is just the sheer extent and number of peacekeepers that are across the African continent. We're talking about tens of thousands of troops, and so some of these things are just the normal course of action when you have that many young men, especially operating in completely foreign environments. That being said, some of these accusations are truly disturbing. We've seen, very extensive involvement in illegal smuggling routes, for example, in prostitution rings, in sort of the spread of disease and other types of major issues that have affected many of these countries detrimentally. So yes, it is a major concern, something that the UN has consistently had to deal with throughout the history of peacekeeping.
Well, precisely. Many of these things are not new concerns. Why has the UN as an institution, or why have the member states that contribute peacekeepers to peacekeeping operations not been able to come to grips with this and deal with this?
Well, I think that there are a number of initiatives that are put in place to try to restrict the behavior of peacekeepers. At some degree, there is a tendency to blame the individual troops who contribute or participate in these missions. But it's very difficult to work in such harsh conditions for such extended periods of time. In my research in Eastern Congo, for example, I spoke with many peacekeepers from India, and most of them, after a number of sexual scandals broke out on base, were restricted to base and were not allowed to go into the town. So they were pretty much isolated from the local community and the local society without any sort of entertainment or any other activities to keep them busy while they were there for these protracted stays.
And over a long period of time,
Yes.
That can become extremely difficult for troops and for their leadership.
I think that's a big part of the problem. I think, we see in many cases that these are missions with, ostensibly short-term mandates, but they can drag on for a decade or 2 decades in the case of Congo. And so you're talking about, thousands of troops who are staying in country for a year at a time, often with very little in terms of, outlets for any sort of social life or cultural activities of any sort.
So before we turn to the question of the changing nature of peacekeeping, I want to talk about the value that peacekeepers have brought to the African continent. We've talked about some of the problems, and some of those problems are pretty severe. They're big social problems. In some cases, they actually exacerbate the conflicts that they are meant to be there. But what is the value, say, in a place like South Sudan of having the peacekeepers there?
I think, if you look at the academic studies on the subject, it shows that in certain conditions, peacekeepers can play a very central role in ensuring that a peace agreement will hold, for example. The problem is that many times we're asking peacekeepers to take on responsibilities and duties that they're not capable of actually fulfilling. If you look at the crisis in South Sudan, for example, or the case of Democratic Republic of Congo, there what's required is a political settlement between national leaders and regional politicians. Instead, we're asking the peacekeepers to, deal with the failure of the broader political process, and that's something that peacekeepers will likely never be able to accomplish.
Do you think that there is evidence that the presence of peacekeepers can delay political settlement? That there's not so much pressure to reach settlement?
I think generally, peacekeeping needs to be understood as a Band-Aid for a major disease, right? It's not going to solve the underlying crises. It can actually contribute to the situation getting worse. And so, to blame peacekeepers for the broader failure of the international community and national governments to respond to these crises is somewhat unfair. That being said, when you bring in tens of thousands of troops, as you've seen in places like Congo and South Sudan, it has a dramatic impact on the local society and community. Peacekeepers come with a tremendous amount of resources. They have a dramatic impact on local economies. They can, dramatically transform the sex industry, for example. All of a sudden, individuals who have no other means of making a living are forced into prostitution. because they have all these peacekeepers there who demand their services. And so we have to think about, the unintended effects of what it means for these largely foreign troops to be spending such extended periods of time in these very fragile environments.
So when we think of UN peacekeepers, obviously we think of the blue helmets. They wear the blue helmet of the UN, but in fact they are national troops, volunteered essentially by their country of origin. How is the face of peacekeeping and peacekeepers changing, if you will?
Good. I think that's a very important point. The assumption that we often have is that the UN perhaps has a standing army constituted of individuals from all these different countries, and that's just not how it works. Instead, what happens is that the Security Council actually establishes a mandate, and then the UN is tasked with recruiting contributions from individual member countries. Historically, there's been a very sort of clear separation between the countries that actually devise the mandate, specifically the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, the permanent members of the Security Council, in other words, and those countries that actually contribute the troops to the missions, which have historically been drawn from the developing world. Particularly South Asia has historically been a very strong contributor of troops to these missions. The problem, of course, is that that sort of division is becoming increasingly unstable. Many of the South Asian countries, India in particular, is no longer satisfied doing what they consider to be just the bidding of the more powerful Security Council members. And so we're starting to see some debates that have gone back probably to the invasion of Libya, where the sort of rising powers, countries like Brazil, China, and India in particular, have been challenging the so-called P3 over who gets to decide the nature of the mandate. As I've shown in this paper that I've just published with African Affairs, the sort of historic line between troop contributing countries, the countries that actually give troops, and those that actually pay for the mandate or pay for the mission itself is increasingly coming under strain, and we can expect severe consequences for the nature of peacekeeping missions in the future.
With the increase of troops supplied by both India and China, this is also a way, because of course they're funded, those troops are funded and supported by the UN, by funds that are contributed by all member states.
Yes.
This is also a way for those countries to maintain perhaps larger militaries than they would otherwise be able to afford.
So historically, one of the advantages for poor countries to participate in these missions is that the missions were often accompanied with quite considerable financial payments. So each troop was given a certain salary that was above what they would make in their own national context. Right. And so this provided an outlet, let's say, especially for some of the South Asian countries, which had very large standing armies, but often didn't have the resources to sustain literally hundreds of thousands of troops. And so sending those troops on peacekeeping missions abroad was one way to deal with the surplus. I think that relationship is changing. I mean, as we see, especially with a country like India, India is now the largest arms buyer in the world, has been the largest arms buyer in the world since 2012.
What's its annual budget?
I actually don't know the exact number. It's compared to the United States, it's a tiny amount. But India's primary rival in the region, of course, is China. And China has been escalating its military budget extensively, and India feels the need to respond to Chinese escalation. In terms of the Chinese, historically, the Chinese did not actually contribute that many troops to UN peacekeeping missions. They preferred to preserve their troops for their own region and did not want to put their troops under the command of a perceived foreign military.
Yes.
Exactly. But we have seen a big change, particularly in the African context, where China has become one of the biggest contributors of troops to the various peacekeeping missions in Africa, and that has gone alongside Chinese investment across the continent.
Zachariah Mampilly, thanks so much for talking with us about that.
Thank you for having me.